I hadn't worn that dress in over a year. It wasn't particularly revealing. Soft, beige cotton, just above the knee, with a narrow waist and a neckline that brushed the line between modesty and suggestion. But something about the way it moved when I walked, or the way it clung to the curve of my back, always made me feel like I was on the edge of becoming someone I wasn't allowed to be. I wore it that evening because it was too hot for jeans, or at least that's what I told myself. The windows were open, letting in the dry air from the yard. Outside, my husband was talking to his brother on the phone, pacing slowly in the shadows near the hedge. His voice sounded the same as always. Steady, competent, maybe a little tired. The way a man sounds when he has nothing to complain about and even less to look forward to. I used to find comfort in that tone. Now it just made the room feel quieter. I stood at the kitchen counter, slicing peaches for the tart I didn't really feel like baking. The scent was sweet, too sweet. It clung to my fingers and made me feel sticky. The kind of summer smell that used to remind me of childhood, of eating with my hands and wiping them on my dress. But now it reminded me how long it had been since someone touched me with any real hunger. The sound of the gate clicking open pulled me out of my thoughts. I didn't look up right away. I knew who it was. He'd arrived that morning. My husband's nephew. 25, just out of grad school, staying in our guest house for a few weeks while doing some corporate internship nearby. I barely remembered him from years ago, just flashes of a teenager too tall for his own limbs and always on his phone. He entered through the back, his footsteps soft and even on the tile. When I turned, he was standing in the archway of the kitchen, a paper bag in one hand, a small bottle of wine in the other. "I thought I'd bring something to dinner," he said, nodding toward the bag. I smiled, a polite smile, the kind you give to strangers or family you barely know. "Thank you. That's thoughtful." He looked different. Not just older, but still. Like someone who had learned to carry himself in a room without needing to prove anything. He didn't fidget. He didn't scan the space nervously. He looked directly at me, and not past me. And I saw it. Just a flicker. A pause in his eyes that lingered a second longer than it should have. He noticed the dress, not in an overt way, but his gaze traced it, then flicked quickly back to my face as if he'd been caught. My pulse jumped, just slightly. The rest of the evening passed without incident. Dinner on the patio, my husband doing most of the talking, him asking about the internship, giving unsolicited advice in the form of anecdotes. I watched them both through the glass as I cleared the dishes. The two of them, different versions of the same man. One older, more settled, worn smooth by routine. The other still forming, still curious, still full of questions. Later, I took my book and sat on the couch, the ceiling fan swirling the thick air above me. My husband retreated to his study, mumbling something about emails. The nephew said he was going for a walk before bed. I heard the guest house door click shut not long after. It should have ended there. But it didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the sheet twisted around my legs, the fan above like a lazy metronome. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at me. It wasn't obscene. It wasn't even flirtatious. It was just aware. I turned over. My husband was asleep, breathing evenly. One arm sprawled across the bed, not touching me. He hadn't touched me in weeks, not in a way that felt like wanting. His affection had become habitual, like brushing teeth or checking the locks. Necessary, but hollow. I remembered the way I used to anticipate his touch. How I would dress for him without seeming like I was trying. The way his hands used to rest on my hips when I passed behind him at the sink. That intimacy had disappeared so slowly I hadn't even noticed its absence. Until now. The next morning, I chose my clothes more deliberately. Not overtly. Nothing that would raise suspicion. A simple shirt, thin enough for the heat to show the faintest outline of the lace beneath. Linen trousers, light blue. I didn't look in the mirror longer than necessary. I didn't want to ask myself what I was doing. He was already in the kitchen when I came down. Barefoot, hair still wet from a shower, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I entered, and that same pause passed between us. but longer this time. We talked. Small things, coffee preferences, the weather, the air conditioner that made a strange sound in the guest house. Our conversation had no urgency, but every word felt like a pebble dropped in still water. I watched the ripples in his expression, in his posture. He never leaned in, but he never backed away. My husband passed through briefly, kissed my cheek, took his laptop, and left for the office. I stayed, and he stayed. When I reached for the sugar jar, our hands brushed. Nothing happened, but everything changed. Later that day, I watched him from the upstairs window as he crossed the yard. The sun lit the back of his neck. He didn't know I was watching. Or maybe he did. I didn't know which possibility unnerved me more. I went to the bedroom and opened the drawer where I kept things I didn't wear anymore. Things I used to wear when I still felt like a woman instead of just someone's wife. I touched the silk, the lace. Let my fingers trail the fabric like memory. I closed the drawer without taking anything out. Not yet. But the decision had already been made. I just hadn't said it out loud. I told myself it would pass. That the sudden quickening of my breath around him, the awareness in my skin whenever he entered the room, it was nothing more than temporary imbalance, a natural reaction to proximity, to novelty. I'd been careful for days, keeping the boundaries intact. But boundaries, I've learned, are more fragile when they're made of silence. That morning, I stood in front of my closet longer than usual. The house was quiet, the kind of heavy morning silence that feels too still for real life. I knew he was in the guest house. The curtains had moved, the door had opened, sounds that only meant one thing. I'd heard the water running through the pipes earlier, his shower. And now I stood there, staring at the row of dresses I rarely wore. So many of them still had the tags. I didn't need anything fancy. I chose something soft, cream-colored that slipped easily over my skin and brushed my knees when I moved. I wore a thin bra underneath, one with lace at the edges, almost invisible beneath the fabric. But I knew it was there. That was enough. By the time I came down, the sun had already climbed high. The kitchen smelled like coffee and toasted bread. He was standing by the counter, barefoot again, dressed in loose joggers and a fitted t-shirt that clung to the shape of his back. He turned when he heard me, and his gaze paused. Not long, not inappropriately, but just enough. I was about to make another pot, he said, holding up the carafe. You want some? Sure, I answered, moving toward the table. The air between us was charged, but not tense. It felt like the air before a summer storm. Something crackling under the surface, waiting for the moment to fall. I sat, trying to steady my hands. He poured my cup without asking how I liked it. Black, just like always. We talked again about nothing, but our silences said more than our words. I noticed how he listened, really listened, and how he watched me without looking away too quickly, like so many others did. I wasn't used to being observed with that kind of softness, with that unspoken question hovering in the space between us. When I leaned forward to reach my cup, the strap of my dress slipped slightly. It wasn't deliberate. Not exactly. I didn't fix it right away. I felt his eyes flick there and back again. And I felt something rise in me. Not shame, not guilt, but heat. We both turned to look at the sound of tires on the gravel. My husband's car pulled into the driveway. He was early. I hadn't expected him for another hour. That was the first time I felt fear. Not because I was doing something wrong, but because I realized I'd begun to want something I could no longer ignore. He came in with grocery bags and a familiar smile, kissed my cheek, asked if we needed anything. He noticed the coffee, made a joke about how I always got the last cup. We laughed, all three of us, like a scene from a harmless sitcom, but I couldn't stop thinking about how close his nephew had been standing. That afternoon passed in a blur of errands and routine. I busied myself with laundry, emails, cleaning drawers that didn't need cleaning. Anything to avoid going outside where he might be. Anything to stop the spinning in my mind. But it didn't work. Later, after dinner, after the kitchen had gone quiet, and the sun had dropped low enough to turn the windows gold, I stepped out onto the back patio with a glass of wine. I didn't see him at first. I wasn't looking for him. But there he was, sitting on the edge of the wooden bench, elbows on his knees, phone in hand, the light catching on his face in that strange, flattering way twilight sometimes does. He looked up when I approached, and we both froze for a second, like we weren't sure if this moment belonged to us. "I didn't think anyone else would be out here," he said. "Neither did I replied, setting my glass down on the small side table. I should have gone back inside. There were 10 reasons to. But instead, I sat beside him, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the warmth of his skin radiating in the space between us. We talked again, about books this time, of all things. He had brought one from the guest house. I don't even remember the title. I just remember the way he held it, the way his voice dropped slightly when he read a line aloud. There was something in that moment. 2 adults, speaking softly, the garden wrapped in shadows, that felt too intimate, too private for the world we were supposed to inhabit. Then I said something. I can't even remember what. A joke, I think. Something sarcastic. He laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real full laugh. And in the middle of it, he reached out to nudge my shoulder, light and playful. But it wasn't playful, because I turned toward him and the laughter faded. Because his hand didn't pull back. Because I didn't move away. I don't know who leaned in first. Maybe it was neither of us. Maybe we simply shifted toward the center of something that had been forming for days. And when our mouths met, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't stolen. It was slow, unspoken, and too real. His lips were warm and tentative at first, like he was asking permission. Mine answered before I could think. I felt it everywhere. In my spine, in my stomach, in the pulse at my wrist. My hand found his jaw without realizing it. His fingers traced my shoulder. And then, a sound. A bird, maybe. A branch creaking. Whatever it was, it pulled us both back. He looked at me. I looked away. Neither of us spoke. I stood, glass forgotten, heart thudding loud enough that I was certain he could hear it. I walked toward the house, not fast, not like I was fleeing, but each step felt heavier than the last. In the bathroom, I stared at myself in the mirror. I didn't look different, but everything had changed. I touched my lips, not for drama, not to romanticize it, but because they still felt warm, alive. My whole face did. I went to bed early, told my husband I had a headache. He offered to bring me tea. I said no. I lay in the dark for hours, staring at the same ceiling, listening to the same fan. But this time, my body felt like it belonged to someone. Not to him, not to the man sleeping beside me, but to me, and to a possibility I couldn't unknow. He avoided me the next day. It wasn't obvious. He was polite, respectful, spoke when spoken to. But the stillness between us had returned, as if the night before had been a dream we'd both agreed not to remember. Only it wasn't a dream. My lips still tingled with the memory, and I could feel the absence of his gaze like a cold spot on the skin. He didn't look at me the way he had before. He didn't look at me at all. At breakfast, he stayed just long enough to grab his toast and coffee. Said he had an early call with someone from the company. My husband didn't notice anything. He never did. He was preoccupied, flipping through emails, one hand on his mug, the other absent-mindedly scrolling. I tried not to let it show. I set the table like always, asked about the day's meetings, offered to pick up dry cleaning. Routine. That's what marriage had become. A choreography of small favors and habitual movements. My husband smiled when he thanked me, the same smile he used for the mailman and the neighbor. I hated how familiar it had become. I hated that it used to be enough. I spent most of the morning cleaning out the downstairs closet, tossing old shoes into bags, folding scarves I hadn't worn in years. I needed the distraction. The physical movement gave my mind something to cling to, but no matter how many pairs of boots I lined up, I kept returning to the night before. The moment our mouths met, how gently his hand had cupped my jaw, the way he'd stepped back like he was afraid of how right it had felt. By noon, I gave up. I grabbed my keys and said I was going to the market. My husband nodded, eyes still glued to his screen. I drove to the farthest store, the one with the overpriced produce and the little cafe that made decent espresso. I didn't need groceries. I just needed to breathe in air that didn't smell like our house. And I needed to stop replaying that kiss. I sat outside with my coffee, sunglasses on, pretending to scroll through my phone. The sun was too bright and the metal chair was too cold, but I stayed there for nearly an hour, nursing the same cup and avoiding my own reflection in the cafe window. On the way home, I stopped at the bookstore. Another excuse, really. I wandered the aisles slowly, grazing my fingers across spines. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just wanted to feel anonymous, to be a woman who simply liked fiction and herbal tea, not someone unraveling in her own kitchen. That's when I saw them, him and my oldest friend. They were standing near the front, laughing. She had her hand on his arm, casual, familiar. She was wearing that soft pink lipstick she always chose for daytime, the one she said made her look approachable but not desperate. Her body leaned slightly toward his. He didn't pull away. They hadn't seen me. I froze in place, a paperback in my hand I hadn't even noticed picking up. My breath caught, and not because I was afraid of being discovered, but because something inside me twisted. I didn't realize I could feel jealousy like that. Not hot, not wild, but cold. Like a slow freeze creeping under the skin. He said something, and she laughed again. That laugh I knew too well. Light and effortless. He glanced toward the exit as if ready to leave, and her hand slipped from his arm, but not before squeezing lightly. I turned and left before they saw me. My pulse was thudding so hard it echoed in my ears. I didn't even buy the book. In the car, I sat for a long moment, fingers gripping the steering wheel, eyes fixed on nothing. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. But I felt displaced, like something I hadn't claimed had already been taken. That evening, I cooked. Nothing fancy. Chicken with lemon, roasted vegetables, wine. I needed the structure, the smell, the sound of oil crackling in the pan. My husband came home, kissed my cheek, opened the mail. He didn't ask about my day. I didn't offer. We sat on the patio under the fading sun, and I poured the wine carefully, watching the red swirl in the glass. He talked about something happening at the office, some disagreement between departments. I nodded, offered a few comments, laughed in the right places. The entire time, I felt his nephew's absence like a missing limb. He didn't join us for dinner. Said he had a headache, needed rest. I knew better. After the dishes were done and my husband had gone inside to finish a report, I stayed outside. The cicadas hummed. A plane passed low overhead, leaving a faint streak across the darkening sky. He came out an hour later, walking quietly across the grass. He stopped a few steps away, hands in his pockets. The silence between us was different now, fuller, weighted with everything we hadn't said. I saw you at the bookstore, I said without looking at him. He didn't answer at first. Then, softly, I didn't think you noticed. She laughed at everything you said, I added. My tone wasn't accusatory, but there was something sharp beneath it. He shifted his weight. She laughed first. That made me turn. You're avoiding me, I said, and I hated how bare the words sounded in the open air. He nodded slowly. I thought it would be easier. For who? His eyes finally met mine. For both of us? A beat passed. I can't do this, he said quietly. Do what? Pretend nothing happened? He exhaled. Pretend it didn't mean anything. The wind picked up then, soft and cool. My dress fluttered lightly around my legs. For a moment, we just stood there, two silhouettes under a heavy sky. I didn't plan it, I whispered. I know. And I don't regret it. This time, he didn't answer. He stepped forward, one step only, and stopped. The distance between us shrank but didn't vanish, and in that space hung everything we couldn't name. I turned and walked back inside. My husband looked up from his laptop as I passed through the living room. Did you water the basil? He asked. Yes, I said. Everything's fine. But nothing was fine. Because that night, I undressed slowly, folding each piece of clothing neatly, mechanically. I slipped into bed beside a man who hadn't kissed me in weeks. I turned away from him, and when he placed a hand on my hip, just lightly in his sleep, I flinched. Not because I didn't want to be touched, but because I wanted to be touched by someone else. And I didn't know how to live with that. My husband brought home roses the next morning, not because it was an anniversary or a celebration. He said they were discounted at the florist down the road, and he thought they might brighten the kitchen. I arranged them in a clear glass vase and set them near the window, where the sun could catch on the petals and make them look more romantic than they were. They didn't smell like anything. He kissed my forehead as he left for the office, his briefcase in one hand, coffee in the other, tie slightly crooked, the way it always was. I stood at the door, watching him back the car down the driveway, and I wondered how long it had been since I kissed him with feeling. Weeks, maybe months, or maybe longer. Intimacy fades quietly, the way light slips from a room at sunset. You don't notice it until you're standing in the dark. I wandered through the morning in half thoughts. Cleaned out the fridge, changed the sheets, moved winter clothes into storage. Mundane tasks, deliberately chosen. I didn't want to think. I didn't want to remember the conversation in the garden. His voice saying he couldn't pretend. The way we stood so close, and yet neither of us reached for the other. Just after noon, I caught my reflection in the mirror at the top of the stairs. There was a faint line across my forehead I hadn't noticed before. My hair needed trimming. My skin looked tired. I touched my lips again, as if trying to summon that spark back into them. The feeling of his mouth, the quiet heat that lingered for hours after. I walked into the bedroom, opened the drawer where I kept the lingerie I rarely wore anymore. I used to buy it with the intention of being a certain kind of wife. Attentive, attractive, playful. But I'd long stopped bothering. My husband never noticed, and over time, I stopped noticing myself. I took out a bra, navy blue with sheer lace and matching underwear. I held it against my body, just for a second. The mirror didn't lie. I looked good. Not young, not in that way, but alive. And in that moment, I realized how deeply I had missed feeling visible. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message. From him. I'm sorry about last night. Can we talk? Simple words. But they struck something deep and immediate in me. The way someone tapping on a glass can startle you. Not because it's loud, but because you didn't realize you'd been holding your breath. I waited half an hour before replying. Yes, I'll be in the garden after 3. The hours crawled. I rearranged the patio chairs twice, made tea I didn't drink, changed into something soft and light, a button-up blouse that hinted at skin without offering too much, and a linen skirt that moved when I did. I told myself I wasn't dressing for him, but I knew that I was. At 3, I went outside and sat beneath the large maple tree. The garden had grown thick in recent weeks, vines curling around the trellis, lavender blooming along the stone path. It smelled like summer, warm and sharp and restless. I heard the gate creak open behind me. He walked slowly, hands in the pockets of his jeans, eyes shadowed but steady. He didn't sit immediately. He stood a few feet away, looking down at me like he was still deciding whether he was allowed to be there. I didn't mean to upset you, he said quietly. You didn't, I answered, though that wasn't entirely true. He looked past me, toward the rose bushes lining the edge of the fence. I wasn't expecting her to be there, he added, meaning my friend. She touches everyone, I said. It doesn't mean anything. But it meant something to you, he said, finally looking at me again. I didn't respond. The silence stretched between us, not awkward, just full of the things we hadn't said since that night. Full of the kiss we hadn't acknowledged, the wanting we both tried to suppress. I don't want this to be a mistake, he said, stepping closer. I tilted my head. Then don't let it be one. He sat beside me, not close, not touching, but the nearness of him made my breath come shallower. I could smell his cologne, faint and clean, and the heat of his skin felt like a tide edging closer. We talked. Not about the kiss, not about what it meant, but about small things. His internship, his thoughts about the city, the weight of expectations he felt pressing in from all directions. He spoke more openly than I'd heard him speak before. And I listened, not just with interest, but with hunger. Hunger for something real, unfiltered, unperformed. At one point, he leaned back, arms behind his head, face tilted toward the sun. The gesture stretched his shirt across his chest. My eyes followed the movement, my body tightening in ways I couldn't disguise. When he turned his head toward me again, I didn't look away. "You keep doing that," he said. "What?" Looking at me like I'm not supposed to notice. I felt my cheeks flush, but I didn't smile. "You notice everything," I said. "I notice you." The words sat between us like a lit match. Then, the shift. He leaned in, slowly, cautiously, but with intention. And I met him halfway. This kiss was not like the first. This one held a question and an answer. This one lingered. His hands found my waist. My fingers traced the edge of his jaw. Our mouths moved slowly, deliberately, not rushed, not desperate, but full of all the restraint we'd tried to maintain. We kissed like we'd earned it. Like we were both afraid of how much we needed it. When we finally pulled apart, I kept my eyes closed for a second longer than necessary. And then I whispered, "I don't want to stop." He nodded, forehead against mine. "Then don't." I stood, legs unsteady, brushing the wrinkles from my skirt. He didn't follow. He watched me walk back toward the house, watched the sway of my hips, the curve of my back. And I knew, without looking, that he wanted more. Inside, the house felt different. The air thicker, the silence heavier. I went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and waited. 10 minutes later, the door to the guest house opened. 10 more, and I heard his footsteps on the stone path again. But this time, he didn't come all the way. This time, he stopped beneath the window, looking up, hands at his sides. And I watched him choose restraint. Watched him burn with the same fire that had started to consume me. And I didn't close the curtain. The morning after felt stiller than usual, as if the entire house had agreed to keep quiet. Even the floorboards under my feet made less noise, creaking with caution as I stepped across them. I hadn't slept much. Not from guilt, but from something far more unsettling. Anticipation. There was no longer anything left to interpret or suppress. The line had been crossed. Twice. Not in the same way, not with the same intensity, but enough that pretending was no longer an option. And while I didn't know what that meant yet, I knew it had happened. It had changed me. Not the kisses themselves, but the way they made me feel afterwards. Like my skin didn't quite fit anymore. Like I'd slipped into someone else's body and was only now realizing how comfortable it was. I chose my clothes carefully that day. Not with the usual routine of getting dressed to pass time until the next errand, but with intention. The sun was sharp, and the forecast promised heat. So I wore a flowing cream skirt with a slit that moved when I walked and a light blouse that nodded at the waist. Beneath it, a bra I had never worn before. Deep green silk, a gift to myself that had sat at the back of a drawer for too long. He was already in the kitchen when I came down, shirtless, sipping water by the open refrigerator. His back was to me, the morning light catching the muscles that moved under his skin as he reached for something. I stopped in the doorway, unnoticed, and for a brief moment, just watched. He turned at the sound of my footsteps. His eyes swept over me quickly, then lingered. There was no pretense anymore. No careful avoidance. His gaze told me everything. I poured myself a glass of water to mask the shaking in my fingers. Neither of us spoke. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. The space between us felt too narrow, and yet neither of us moved. My husband walked in seconds later, laptop under his arm, tie already loosened as if he were preparing to undo the day before it began. He kissed my cheek, muttered something about traffic and conference calls, then turned to his nephew. "You settled in all right? Everything working in the guest house?" "Yeah," he replied, glancing at me only once. "Everything's fine." They exchanged a few more words. I didn't follow. I just nodded, smiled, made the appropriate noises. My body was buzzing with tension I couldn't show. The weight of the morning pressed against my chest. When my husband finally left, the silence that fell was deafening. We didn't speak. Not yet. I went out to the patio, sat with my coffee, watching the wind move through the garden. A few minutes later, he followed. He stood at the edge of the stone path, like he wasn't sure how close he was allowed to come now. My heart beat harder than I wanted it to. I didn't sleep, he said finally. I looked up. Neither did I. He sat beside me, close this time. His thigh brushed mine. It was a simple touch, but it lit something inside me, something I had kept locked away for too long. I felt his hand near mine, not touching, just there, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin. "What are we doing?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I didn't have an answer, but I couldn't pretend I wanted to stop. "I don't know," I said, "but I don't want it to be over." He nodded, looked down at his hands. "I think about it all the time. The other night. I can't stop." I turned toward him. The garden blurred in my vision. All I could see was the line of his jaw, the tension in his throat, the way he held himself like he was trying not to fall apart. "I want to kiss you again," he said, quietly, not demanding, not manipulating, just truth. "Then do it." And he did. This one was different, deeper, no longer careful. My hand reached up and slid behind his neck, fingers tangling in his hair. His lips moved against mine with the kind of urgency that had been held back for too long, and my whole body responded before I had time to think. He pulled me closer. My blouse shifted, loosened slightly. My skirt pressed against his leg. I could feel his breath in my ear when we broke apart, his hands resting lightly on my waist. We sat there, tangled and breathless, the garden spinning around us. It was midday, bright and unapologetically exposed, and we didn't care. After a moment, I straightened, smoothing my hair, regaining composure. He looked at me as if he was seeing me for the first time, not like someone's wife or a fleeting temptation, but like someone he desired with a kind of aching sincerity. "Are you scared?" I asked. "Yes," he said, "but I don't want to stop." Neither did I. I went inside first, needing space, air, something to hold on to. The house felt different, brighter. Or maybe I was different in it now. That night, after dinner, after the quiet, predictable routine, I turned to my husband as he stood by the sink, drying the wine glasses with that absent expression he always wore at the end of the day. "I think we need a break," I said. He stopped, looked at me. His face didn't register it right away. "A break from what?" "From us," I said. He blinked slowly. The silence was crushing. "You're not serious." "I am." He set the glass down too hard, and it made a sharp noise on the counter. "I thought things were fine." "That's the problem," I said. "Everything's fine, but I'm not." He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't raise his voice. That wasn't his way. He nodded, stepped back, and left the room. Later, alone in the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at my reflection in the full-length mirror. My hair was loose around my shoulders, my lips slightly swollen, my skin flushed. For the first time in years, I looked like someone who wanted more, and I no longer felt the need to apologize for that. Before I turned off the lights, I sent a message. "You can stay longer, if you want." The reply came within minutes. "I do." And I knew as I lay down in that too-wide bed that nothing about my life would ever return to the way it had been. We didn't talk about what had happened. Not directly. There was no need to. After that last kiss, after the conversation with my husband, things began to rearrange themselves in the house. Quietly, like furniture being moved in the night. He remained in the guest house. My husband moved into the smaller bedroom down the hall, with the explanation that he'd been waking earlier than me and didn't want to disturb my sleep. It was said with politeness, The way you'd excuse yourself from a dinner table you no longer felt comfortable at. We still had coffee together in the mornings. We still asked about each other's plans. But the intimacy had evaporated. All that was left was the residue of civility. Polite, intact, and entirely hollow. I began spending more time out of the house. Errands, long walks through the park, bookstore visits that turned into hours. I didn't lie. Not really. I just started choosing which parts of the truth to say out loud. He and I grew bolder in our silence. We never touched in the open, never kissed again after that day in the garden. But the air between us had changed. Every passing glance, every shared breath in the hallway, every brief encounter in the kitchen carried weight. He noticed when I wore something different. Not always outwardly, but in the way his eyes caught on the neckline of a blouse, or the slow way they followed me when I turned away. I started dressing with that knowledge. Not provocatively. That wasn't the point. But deliberately. Light fabrics. Soft tones. Lingerie I chose for myself. Silk and lace and muted colors that made me feel like I had something worth discovering again. I paid attention to the shape of my silhouette in the mirror, the way my collarbone looked in certain lights. It wasn't vanity, it was rediscovery. We had lunch together once in a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and an old theater downtown. The kind of place with cracked wooden tables and dusty windows. It was unplanned. I had mentioned it in passing the night before while putting away dishes, and the next afternoon, he was there, waiting. We didn't sit close. We didn't touch. But the way he looked at me while I spoke, I felt it everywhere. I told myself that as long as we didn't cross any more lines, we could keep it under control. But desire doesn't work like that. Desire is patient. It waits in the background, watching until one moment, one breath, one glance, breaks the illusion of control. It happened on a Tuesday, late afternoon. The house was empty. My husband had left for an overnight conference in another city. I had just come back from the market and was unloading groceries, the cool air from the fridge kissing my calves. The door creaked behind me and I turned to find him standing there, shirt clinging to his chest from the heat outside. He didn't speak. Neither did I. We just stared at each other, my hands still full of apples. His gaze dropped briefly to my waist, where the hem of my blouse had ridden up. He stepped forward, slowly, like he was giving me the chance to stop it. I didn't. But he didn't touch me. He reached past me casually, pulling a bottle of water from the fridge. His arm brushed mine, and the contact made my breath catch. He twisted the cap, took a sip, then leaned against the counter. "You look different," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Like you're waiting for something." I swallowed. "Maybe I am." He set the bottle down. The room felt smaller. "You think he suspects anything?" he asked. "Not yet." "But he will." "I know." He nodded slowly. Then, softly, "What are you going to do?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. That night, I stood in the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, water still clinging to my skin. I stared at my reflection for a long time, the steam curling at the corners of the mirror. My body looked the same, but I felt like a different woman. Not because of anything he had done, but because of who I was becoming around him. I slipped into a navy blue nightgown. Simple, silk, barely brushing the tops of my thighs. I had worn it once years ago, during a vacation with my husband, when things still felt new. He hadn't noticed it then. But now, wearing it again, I didn't need his attention. I needed to feel it against my skin. I left the bedroom light off. Somewhere outside, I heard a door shut. The soft click of his guest house. I didn't go to him. Not yet. Instead, I went to bed alone and lay there in the dark, feeling my heartbeat echo in places I hadn't felt alive in years. In the morning, he was already gone. Left a note on the table saying he had a meeting across town, would be back late. I stared at the handwriting for a long time. It was neat, precise, unassuming. But I traced my finger across the ink as if it held something more. The next few days passed slowly. He kept his distance. I didn't push. We were both waiting. Not out of fear, but out of some unspoken understanding that the moment we crossed the next line, there would be no going back. Then came the call. My husband from his conference. He sounded tired. "There's been a change," he said. "I'm coming back early." "How early?" "Tonight." I stared at the phone long after the call ended. That evening, the house returned to its old rhythm. The sound of keys dropping in the bowl by the door, the rustle of shoes on the mat, the soft hum of the television in the next room. He kissed my cheek. I smiled. I asked about his flight. He told me about turbulence and bland hotel coffee. We went to bed at the same time for the first time in weeks. He lay beside me, one hand resting on my hip. I didn't move. Not away. Not closer. Just still. And in that stillness, I realized that something had quietly shifted again. That I was no longer choosing between two men, but between two versions of myself. And the woman I used to be, obedient, reliable, invisible, was slipping further away with each passing day. I didn't mourn her. I let her go. He left the next morning without a word. Not my husband. The other one. The only one whose absence I felt with an ache behind my ribs. I heard the car pull out just as I was stepping out of the shower, a glance through the blinds revealing his silhouette behind the wheel. No message. No explanation. Just gone. I told myself it was nothing. That maybe he had errands, an interview, some appointment across town. I told myself not to read into the silence, not to take it personally. But of course I did. Because silence, when you're waiting for something more, isn't empty. It's a wait. My husband had returned to his usual routines, falling back into place with the same practiced ease he brought to everything. Work, conversation, sleep. He didn't ask why I was quiet at breakfast. He didn't comment on the way I stirred my coffee for far too long, or the way I kept checking my phone with feigned disinterest. He didn't notice. That's what made it harder. By afternoon, the silence had become unbearable. I sent a message, short and cautious. "Everything all right?" No reply. I kept checking, every 10 minutes, every 5. Each time I set the phone down, a fresh wave of humiliation crept through me. Maybe this was his way of stepping back, of correcting the course we'd veered off from. Maybe he had decided to leave things as they were. 2 kisses, a handful of glances, a fire we'd flirted with but never let burn. The thought hollowed me. I spent the rest of the day drifting. I went through the motions of cleaning, folding laundry, making dinner, all the mindless tasks that gave structure to the waiting. My husband worked late, ate quickly, retreated to the study. He said goodnight around 10. I nodded and stayed on the sofa, the television flickering across the room, volume low enough to hear my own pulse. At 11, my phone buzzed. "Are you free tomorrow?" "I need to see you." 7 words. That was all it took for my body to exhale. I typed back slowly, as if pretending I hadn't been waiting all day. "Yes. Tell me when." The reply came almost instantly. "Meet me in Redmond, corner of 6th and Oak, 1 o'clock. No explanation, no reason why. I stared at the message, then at the clock. In 14 hours, I would see him again. My mind raced with questions. Why that place, what he wanted to say, what he thought had changed. But none of it mattered. He had asked to see me. That was enough. I barely slept. The next morning, I dressed with a kind of precision I hadn't felt in years. A soft, sleeveless blouse in pale ivory, tailored pants that hugged my hips but didn't scream for attention, heels just high enough to make me walk with intent. Underneath, the same green silk bra, the one that made me feel like my skin mattered again. I told my husband I had errands in town. He barely looked up from his laptop. He asked if I'd pick up more coffee. I said I would. The drive to Redmond took 40 minutes. The sky was a pale, muted gray, the kind that made everything feel cinematic. I found the corner easily. A small cafe with black awnings and crooked flower boxes in the windows. I parked 2 blocks away, my heart pounding with every step I took toward him. He was already there, sitting outside with a coffee, sunglasses on, one leg crossed over the other. He looked older in that moment, not by age, but by weight, like something had settled over him, or maybe within him. He stood when he saw me. I sat before he could speak. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The street buzzed around us, cars, pedestrians, the clatter of dishes inside. But our silence was different now. It didn't feel tentative. It felt charged. "Thanks for coming," he said finally. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again," I admitted. He looked down, then back up, his expression careful. "I needed space to think." "And?" He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "They offered me a position, out of state." The words struck like cold water. "How long have you known?" "A few days." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know what I wanted." I swallowed. The lump in my throat refused to budge. "And now?" He met my gaze. The sunglasses came off. "I don't want to go." I exhaled, slowly. Relief mixed with panic, because the next words had to come from me, and I wasn't sure what they were. "I don't want you to go either," I said, voice barely above a whisper. "But you're still married." "I'm still trying to figure out what that means." His jaw clenched, not in anger, in restraint. "I can't stay if I'm just your secret," he said. "You're not? Not anymore." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Not yet. We didn't talk about logistics, not about how to manage the house or what to say to my husband, or where we could go without being seen. None of that mattered. What mattered was that for the first time since all of this began, we were no longer pretending. "I want you," I said. And then, with a quiet smile, he stood. "Come with me." I didn't ask where. I followed. We walked through the narrow streets of downtown until we reached an old bookstore tucked between a laundromat and a record shop. It looked like it hadn't changed in decades. Wooden shelves, creaky floors, the scent of old paper and dust. We wandered the aisles in silence. Occasionally, our hands brushed. Eventually, we found ourselves in the back corner, hidden behind a row of art books. The air was still. His hand found mine. I didn't pull away. There, among forgotten volumes and fading pages, he leaned in. The kiss was different again. This one was slow, reverent. The kind of kiss that doesn't ask for permission because it already knows the answer. My back pressed against the bookshelf. His hand traced my jaw, the other resting on my waist. My body melted into him, every part of me remembering exactly why I had wanted this, why I couldn't go back. When we finally pulled apart, I looked up at him, breathless. "I need to go back soon," I said. "He'll notice if I'm gone too long." He nodded, but he didn't step away. "I'm not leaving," he said. "Not unless you ask me to." And I knew then that everything had changed. Again. But this time I wasn't afraid. I returned home just before sunset. The light stretched long across the kitchen floor, warm and golden, the kind of light that makes everything look softer than it is. My husband was seated at the counter, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him, a newspaper folded in his lap. He looked up when I entered but said nothing. His eyes flicked briefly to the clock, then back to me. He didn't ask where I'd been, and I didn't offer. Instead, I went to the sink, washed my hands slowly, watching the water swirl down the drain. I could still feel the pressure of his mouth on mine. The smell of old books still clung faintly to my blouse. I hadn't changed. I didn't want to. I wanted the evidence to linger, if only for a little longer. It made everything feel more real. "Did you get the coffee?" my husband asked. I nodded. "It's in the car. I'll bring it in later." We didn't speak again for the rest of the evening. Dinner was quiet. We ate leftovers, roasted chicken, steamed rice, a salad I dressed without tasting. He read the news on his tablet, chewing slowly, occasionally muttering something under his breath. I sat across from him, watching the candle flicker between us, realizing how little light was left in our shared space. Afterward, he retreated to the living room, stretching out on the couch with the television on low. I stayed in the kitchen, wiping down an already clean counter, folding a dish towel 3 times over. The silence between us wasn't hostile. It was familiar. The silence of people who had run out of questions. I stood there for a long time, watching him through the doorway. I tried to remember when I had stopped loving him, or if I ever had. It wasn't that I didn't care. I did. He was a good man, stable, reliable, gentle in his own distant way. But the space between us had grown so gradually, so quietly, that neither of us had noticed until it was too wide to cross without breaking something. And I had already broken something. That night, I lay in bed beside him, fully clothed. He turned off the light without touching me. No kiss, no goodnight, no lingering glance. Just darkness. His breathing soon settled into the rhythm of sleep, and I lay there, staring at the ceiling, tracing invisible shapes into the air with my fingers. I didn't sleep. I thought about the bookstore, the way his hand had found mine, unafraid. The way he had kissed me, not like a thief, not like someone stealing something forbidden, but like someone claiming what he believed to be his. The next morning, the air felt heavier. A storm was coming. The sky had turned to slate, and the wind pushed against the windows with steady insistence. I brewed coffee before anyone else was awake, the smell rising like a promise. I needed time alone. I needed air. I left a note on the counter. Went for a walk. Back soon. No one would ask where. I drove without a destination, the streets familiar and yet distant. Every corner held memory now. Every place we had spoken, touched, looked at each other with meaning. They were all etched into the geography of my daily life. I passed the cafe, the bookstore, the park where I had once sat with my husband in a life that no longer felt like mine. Eventually, I found myself by the water. The bay was quiet, the tide low, the horizon wrapped in fog. I parked the car and walked to the edge of the pier, hands in my coat pockets, hair whipping around my face. The wind chilled my skin but cleared my mind. He had said he wouldn't leave unless I asked him to. And I hadn't. I wasn't going to. I sat on a bench overlooking the shore and closed my eyes. I tried to picture a future. Not the glossy version with perfection and happy endings, but something real. Messy, flawed, built from pieces of what was and what could still be. And I saw him in it. Not as a fantasy, not as a rebellion, but as someone I wanted beside me, not for escape, but for presence. When I got home, my husband was in the garden, pruning the hedges. He looked up, sweat on his brow, gloves tucked into his belt. I waved, smiled, kept walking. I didn't know if he noticed the distance in my eyes, or if he chose not to. The guest house door was open. He was there, seated on the small couch by the window, a book in his lap, one leg bent under him. He looked up when I entered, and his expression shifted immediately, a mixture of concern and relief. "Are you okay?" he asked, rising. I needed to think. "And?" I closed the door behind me. "I'm not going back to who I was." He nodded. "I didn't think you would." We stood there, facing each other in the small room that had seen the beginning of all this. The room that now felt more like home than any part of the main house. "I don't know what happens next," I said. "I haven't figured it out. But I know I want to figure it out with you." His face didn't change, but I saw something release in his shoulders, a tension he had carried for weeks. "I'm not asking you to choose today," he said. "I just needed to know that I wasn't imagining this, that it wasn't just me." "It's not just you," I said. "It's never been just you." He stepped closer, close enough to brush my arm with his, but he didn't touch me. Not yet. The restraint between us had become its own language, a quiet, aching intimacy that said more than any kiss. "I should go," I whispered. He nodded but didn't move away. "Stay," he said. The word was soft, not a command, not a plea, just an offering. I looked at the door, then back at him. And I stayed. We didn't touch. Not that night. We talked about everything and nothing. About who we had been before we met. About the places we wanted to go. about the fear that sat behind every heartbeat and every breath. And then, as the rain began to fall against the windows, we sat in silence, wrapped in blankets. Close but not touching, because we had time. And for the first time in years, I wanted more of it. Autumn settled in like a quiet guest who didn't plan to leave. The air grew sharper in the mornings, crisp enough to make me reach for a sweater before coffee. Leaves turned without ceremony, shedding color across the yard. A slow and steady unraveling that mirrored something in me. The house changed with the season. My husband said less, lingered longer over the mail, began scheduling work trips further apart. We still shared meals. We still folded the laundry together, but we no longer reached for each other in the night. We no longer bothered to pretend. He hadn't asked questions, not about where I went, not about how I looked when I returned. I wondered sometimes whether he knew, whether he had always known. But whatever lived behind his eyes never surfaced. His silence wasn't denial. It was resignation. The kind that comes after a long drought when the soil has given up on rain. I found myself drawn more often to the guest house. Sometimes just to sit, to think, to breathe in a space that felt stripped of obligation. Sometimes he was there, sometimes he wasn't. But always it felt like something mine. Not owned, not claimed, but chosen. One afternoon, I brought over a small tray, 2 mugs of coffee, a plate of shortbread cookies, napkins folded neatly. A peace offering, though peace wasn't what we needed. We needed clarity, and time, and space to ask questions we had avoided for too long. He looked up from his notebook when I entered. His eyes always met mine like he had been waiting. Not impatiently, just sure I would come. I set the tray down on the small table near the window and sat across from him. "You always bring cookies when you're about to say something difficult," he said, smiling faintly. I didn't know it was a pattern. "You do a lot of things you don't notice." He poured the coffee. We drank in silence. "I'm not sure what I'm doing anymore," I said. "I'm not even sure where I belong." "You're not a thing to be placed," he said gently. "You belong wherever you feel most alive." I looked at him. "And that's not here?" "No," he said. "It could be, but not like this. Not in secret. Not as the part of your life you tuck away between appointments." I swallowed. The truth of it sat in my chest like a stone. I never meant for any of this to happen. I know. I wasn't looking for an escape. "You weren't escaping anything," he said. "You were trying to remember who you are." I wanted to cry at that. Not from sadness, but from recognition. It had been so long since someone saw me without needing to explain what they saw. He didn't need me to be anything. And in that freedom, I had discovered more of myself than I had in years of careful living. I told him I needed time, I said. What did he say? He said I could have it. He nodded. Do you believe him? I don't know. He set his mug down. Do you still love him? I thought for a long time. I love who we were, who I thought we could be, but I don't know if I love who we've become. He didn't press further. I want to choose this, I said quietly. Not because it's easier or exciting or new, but because it feels honest. Then choose it, he said. Choose it with both hands. But I didn't. Not that day. I walked back to the house and stood outside the front door for almost 10 minutes. The wind tugged at my coat. I looked through the window at the living room, the sofa we had bought together, the painting I had chosen for the hallway, the bookshelves filled with his political biographies and my paperbacks. A life built carefully, brick by brick, for years. Inside, he was sitting in his usual chair, reading. The television murmured in the background. The lamp beside him gave off a golden glow. He looked up when I entered. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, something flickered between us. Not anger, not even sadness, but a quiet recognition. The acknowledgement that a season was ending. That night, I didn't go to the guest house. I stayed in my room, packed a small suitcase, and sat on the edge of the bed until the moon moved across the window. In the morning, I made coffee. I wrote a note. I need space. Not because I don't care, but because I do. I'll call you when I can speak clearly. I didn't say more. He was still asleep when I left. I didn't cry in the car. Not even when I passed the familiar landmarks. The grocery store, the school we'd once talked about sending kids to, the cafe where we had celebrated anniversaries with practiced smiles. I drove north, toward nowhere in particular, the suitcase humming in the back seat. The silence in the car strangely comforting. I ended up in a coastal town 3 hours away. A small motel with whitewashed walls and rooms that smelled faintly of salt and cedar. I paid for a week in advance. I unpacked slowly. I opened the windows. I stood on the balcony and watched the tide move in. He called that evening. I let it ring. Not because I didn't want to hear his voice, but because I wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. Instead, I wrote everything I had been afraid to say aloud, about the years of silence, the slow erosion of touch, the way I had felt invisible and guilty for feeling it, the way his gaze had made me remember I was still here. I didn't send it, but I needed to write it. I spent the next few days walking, thinking, remembering, not deciding. Not yet. On the 5th day, I stood by the window and watched the sea crash against the rocks below. And I thought of him. Not my husband. The one who waited without expectation. The one who told me I didn't need to be placed. And I realized I was no longer running. I was returning. To myself. To something I hadn't known how to name. I picked up the phone. And this time I dialed first.